On bass, recently arrived from the dark side of the moon, Mr. Stuart Sutcliffe.
Money don't get everything, it's true. But what it don't get, I can't use, I need more.
Backbeat tells the story of a man who, torn between his gift for painting and his love of music, missed fame by a moment. Stuart Sutcliffe was the brightest star who never shone.
People in Liverpool respect Stuart, and he's got this, cult, rebel kind of artistic reputation, who's very respected and very cool, and everybody around here knows who he is. But as far as LA and people, some people, when I said I was playing the fifth Beatle, said, "Oh yeah, the drummer, right? The Pete Best, right?" And no, Stuart Sutcliffe. And who's that? And they don't know. And there's this whole, that's what's so great. This explores the whole young generation of that period, which then led to the part that everybody knows about.
What do you think?
You want the truth?
Please.
Hanging's too good for it.
John met Stuart in Liverpool Art College in 1957, and Paul McCartney and George Harrison were at the Institute, which was this part of the same building around the corner. It was a school, a high school, and that's how they got it together.
Listen, John, this group can't carry Stu. You know that, don't you? We're not that good.
You want him out?
That's not what I said.
Listen, you. If Stu goes, I go. Do you understand that?
Apparently one of the great sources of conflict between McCartney and Lennon and Sutcliffe as well was the fact that McCartney was not impressed by Sutcliffe's musical abilities.
He loves being on stage and loves the way the people are and the energy. I don't think he really, he likes rock and roll too, but that's not his main interest. He's a painter, and that's where his mind's at.
At the heart of Backbeat is the love story between Stuart and the girl he met when the band went to Germany in 1960, Astrid Kircher. A photographer, Astrid was a leading light of Hamburg's artistic community, and she's widely credited with designing the famous mop-top look of the Beatles.
This was actually the first time that Astrid had ever seen rock and roll live, ever. And so to imagine this is the first time to be seeing this, it was something completely different than everything they were used to. And that and the magnetism that these boys had on stage, and Stuart's had an aura about him.
Ich liebe dich.
What's that?
I love you. In German.
Only in German?
Anyway, you wish.
It's an incredible love story, Stuart and Astrid found love. It's like they were the same people. And very rarely in movies today do you see that. Usually it's just a very plain, simple, boring love affair, and we've all done so many of those.
He's jealous.
I think so.
You hurt his feelings.
He'll get over it.
It's a triangle of three very incredible people, John Lennon, who's incredibly brilliant, who Stu recognizes his brilliance. John Lennon's respect and admiration for Stuart. Stuart's love for Astrid, John's jealousy because, he wants a girl like Astrid. There's a lot of stuff going on between these three people.
There were things about Stuart which basically John was still trying to learn, and Stuart had already learned from whatever. John had too many inhibitions already placed on him. He also felt basically unloved. If you go by the theory that his mother died when he was young, his father was never around. And Stuart was the first person he kind of felt kind of close to emotionally. So he needed Stuart as much as, for his own purposes, as much as Stuart needed him.
She thinks I'm queer, Astrid.
Bollocks.
You heard her. She thinks I fancy you.
That's not what she said. What she said was she thinks we love one another.
And what did you say?
I might have grunted.
The most vital piece of casting was for the role of Stuart Sutcliffe, and though Stephen Dorff already has a rock-style following of his own, even he admits that the choice of an American to play the fifth Beatle was a gamble.
I think a lot of people are anxious to hear what my accent will sound like, because a lot of people in Liverpool might find it a shock that someone from America is playing Stu Sutcliffe, but all I can do is say when you see the movie, I think you'll be pleased. I've never felt as close to a character as I do with him.
Basically, what he tries to do is basically be one of the lads, which is working out quite well because now he is. I mean, he had a long way to come for us. We all sort of
instantly knew each other because we all came from the same background. And Stephen's come from a completely different background.
Truth is, I'm not much of a bass player. It's all luck. It's all John's idea. It means the world to him, the band, making a record.
Because the Beatles are so well known, the casting of each member of the band was a real challenge to the filmmakers.
Tráilers.
It would be great,
Visita mi
obviously,
canal.
if you could cast the young Beatles with a bunch of actors who are also musicians and are also complete doppelgangers of the characters they're supposed to be. But in the real world, it's just not going to happen. Which is why you get someone like me, who's not only Scottish and not only right-handed, but is not from Liverpool and can't play an instrument. It's just not going to happen. But I think that in the context of the film, hopefully 5-10 minutes into it, the illusion of the screen will be enough to sustain people's belief in order to, with enough time to tell the story,
I'm not sure if the Beatles were particularly themselves anyway, and they were almost in a film themselves, just doing an act of it, a parody of themselves, and like you're trying to do that as well. So you've got to be careful because you might end up doing the Monkeys or something, and that would be funny, wouldn't it?
Must be about 1 million Beatles experts who all think that they know the definitive version of how he walked, how he talked, how his... I mean, I personally don't look anything like him. But what I hope to do is create a character which is believable, not to do a John Lennon impersonation, because that's somebody else's job. My job as an actor is to basically look at the text, look at the way the journeys, the character of the journey of the character rather, the emotional journey of the character, and create a three-dimensional character that the audience will just forget instantaneously that it's not. Don't think about it.
Hey, it's a bit rough out there.
It's not that, mate. It's a bit of a swell, that's all.
You call that a swell?
I call it mother's milk. My dad was a sailor and his dad before him. I'm the son of a sailor.
Bollocks.
I'd like to meet George and apologise. George, if you're listening, sorry, mate.
Yeah.
What is it?
Scones.
Scones?
I've made you some scones.
Mum, they've got food on the ferry,
I know. They haven't got my scones.
I can't take scones. If the lads know you're giving me scones, I'll never hear the end of it. I'm in a rock and roll group, Mum.
You've got Ian, who is a really good laugh. He's very Lennon-esque himself. And you've got poor old Gary from Edinburgh, who, when he first met him, he got the mickey taken out of him somewhat, but he's okay now, and I think he'd make a good Scouser. And he does look quite like Paul as well. And you've got the Pete Best character, who's played by Scott Williams, and he's just so like Pete Best would have been, we think, anyway, no one really knows. But he never smiles or anything, which is quite spooky.
You don't say much, do you?
Drummers don't talk. You must have noticed that.
Well, if you know me, Scott Williams, as a person, you'd know that's what I was like anyway. I think that's probably one of the reasons I was cast, because in the audition I just stood aside and they asked me to play the drums and I did.
Instead of playing that rock and roll music, any old time to use it. It's got a backbeat, you can't lose it. Any old time to use it. It's gotta be rock and roll music. If you wanna dance with me.
I think the music for the film is fantastic. I mean that's great relief to all of us, because it was the thing that we had to get right, the thing that everybody would expect from a film like this. We made a decision early on that we were going to use the rock and roll covers that the Beatles did, because they were in a way they're timeless, and they kind of give us a freedom, because we're not recreating those kind of classic Beatle compositions, but we're doing songs as they would do them, sort of having fun with rock and roll classics.
It's not about portraying a serious artist, and because that's not how they were. Paul McCartney wasn't like, I got to write a song today back then. These were just kids that loved getting drunk and loved to write music and loved to perform, and that's up there. That's all coming through, and it's really exciting to do the music, because I get excited every time we go into the rehearsal, because it's like, I think that's going to be one of the greatest things about the film is the music.
The first time I saw them rehearsing, I was chilled completely. Tears came in my eyes. I mean, they are so powerful when they're together, and I really do believe that there is a certain energy that they are definitely capturing.
Circle time, when love talks Sally, sorry, man, coming anytime, baby.
They were actually a bunch of very wild characters, really. The music that they were playing at the time was all cover versions of old Chuck Berry numbers and things like that. And they had a sort of raw, raucous, kind of almost punky feel about them.
We got one of the top producers in America, Don Was, to put together a band which includes kind of people from grunge groups like Nirvana through to a bass player from REM, and they've recorded it live, all of them playing at once in the studio. This a selection of songs which have got great attack and impact, and we're really delighted with that.
The love story is so special, and it can maybe show people about, you know, I mean, the overall feeling of this movie is so cool. These people are so cool, you know. There's so much spirit and style to each and every one of these people, especially Stuart and Astrid. And that's what an audience is going to get from it. They're going to get how cool these people were, and that you can broaden yourself and trust your own feelings and stuff. I mean, Stuart and Astrid trusted what they wanted to do, and there's no path you need to follow. You follow the path that you want to follow.
There goes Stuart Sutcliffe. That's what they'll say. He could have been in the Beatles. There goes Stu Sutcliffe.
He fell in love with a German girl. He could have been in the Beatles.
I wrote the original draft of the screenplay, and Michael Thomas and Stephen Ward were my co-writers. I saw this photograph of Astrid and Stuart, and I thought, you know, who are these cool, sexy people? You know, why don't we know about them? They look timeless, ahead of their time. So I spent about a mere moment in time, 5 or 6 years, trying to track down Astrid and Stuart's mum and Stuart's sister. And the more I looked into the story, the more I realised there was something here that was really a kind of a hook to hang what I'd been looking for as a story, which was a story about, you know, rock and roll and aspiration and coming of age. The film was shot, some of it in London, Notting Hill, in Liverpool and in Hamburg.
The first day I think was in Liverpool, was in Lark Lane, and I lived at the top of Lark Lane. So we're standing there filming in the window of Hesse's music store, and there's a big camera there. I've got a big wig on, I've got brown contact lenses, and I'm dressed in 1950s clothes. And people who live in our street come up to me and say, "Oh, I see. How's it going?" And I was like, "Sitting at Tony?" I haven't seen Tony for ages. And I was like, "We're filming."
Get away.
Yeah, all right, yeah. Anyway, so like you're there, mate, and you know, so it was great to film Liverpool, but I was glad to get out of it. You know what I mean? Everything we know is from '63 onwards, from when they became famous, or '64. So everything we don't know is what this film's about. So you have to stick to the writing to see what characters been written and created by these 3 people, and just, you know, offer some interpretation of what it's like to be in a band at B19. After the review for not trying to fulfill everyone else's ideas of who he is, and fulfill the criteria of telling the story about friendship and love and loss that is Astrid, Stuart, you know, and John.
I think we had this naivety about the whole project, and it was partly because we didn't realise how difficult it was going to be, and, you know, how long the days were going to be and everything else. But also, we weren't trying to make a official version. We weren't trying to make a biopic.
We had 2 weeks rehearsal. We hung out together as a unit. Gary lived with me while we were doing the film. Scott then moved in for a bit and slept in the living room. And, you know, we spent 24 hours a day with each other, so therefore we quickly got into, you know, being with each other. So therefore, we seemed like a band because we're familiar with each other. We played together, we drank together. I made breakfast in the morning. It was blissful, you know.
Yeah, and those 2 weeks beforehand, we had the music supervisor and the music tutor, and you just played all day, and then in the evenings, for the rest of the crew, sometimes they would, like, you know, put on the show for us. So it was like they were rehearsing for the show.
We rehearsed all day. It was great. You know.
We had a soundtrack that was put together by Don Was, very famous Grammy-winning producer, and amazing people who got together for the band. And right at the beginning, the idea was that we didn't want sound-alikes. it was just people that had that same energy. I mean, everybody that saw them in Hamburg said it was like a punk band, it was like a dance band, an incredible sound that you'd never heard before that hit you in the chest. So we had the drummer from Nirvana, Mick Mills from R.E.M. on bass, guys from Soul Asylum, Afghan Wigs, and these guys all got together, their record companies released them, and just gave this incredible kind of kick-ass soundtrack.
Yeah, it seemed to be received well, didn't it?
Yeah, I mean, there's the strange kind of shape happened in terms of expectation and the experience that after the second day of shooting, I remember thinking, well, if it all goes belly up or I'm fired, I've got 10 great minutes, and then I'll be able to go on and perhaps get another film just using this 10 minutes, or I might get a series on Brookside or something. And then about 2 weeks into the shooting, Steve Woody, one of the producers, was in Cannes where we'd cut together this little reel. He said, people really do like this film. But at the same time, we were still kind of under pressure, the financiers, is it going to go straight to video? And we were still in that frame of mind when somebody from Gramercy, who was the sort of the American distributor, came to see it. And they said, I think this film's going to do really well. So at which point we previewed it in America. And it went down pretty well. And then we were selected as the opening night film of the Sundance Film Festival in Park City. Sundance Film Festival has 2 opening nights, one in Salt Lake City. And the opening night in Salt Lake City was 4 Weddings and a Funeral.
Yeah.
So we all found ourselves on a plane with Hugh Grant and Richard Curtis and skiing down the slopes with these guys. And there were 2 films that Polygram had. There was 4 Weddings and Backbeat. And somebody came up to me, not realising I was the director of Backbeat, saying, how can we derail this Backbeat bandwagon? Because nobody in Polygram wants to know about 4 Weddings. And everyone was being euphoric, you're such a hit in the festival. And I thought, I think they're just getting a little bit too ahead of themselves here. But having said that, the reaction that we get, musicians, I think one of the things that's very reassuring to us is that musicians really think that there's some truth in there, it rings true. And Cynthia Lennon told Julian Lennon to come to the premiere of the film in England because she said, you're going to meet your father tonight. I remember we were shooting one of the love scenes with Stephen and Cheryl, and there was this kind of hushed, respectful thing. Everybody's sort of pretending that they're not looking anywhere. And one of the quietest members of the crew, who was the dolly grip, the guy that pushes the camera, he came out to the set with his head down, and when he put his head up, he got a couple of polystyrene cups and stuck them on his eyes, great big kind of eyes popping out of his head, which was a good thing to break the ice, which is,
There's an air of anticipation when you know that scene's going up, but as soon as you actually get to do it, the practicalities of actually making the film overshadow any kind of voyeuristic,
I don't know, I think that there were certain scenes, like with the groupies, there was a definite kind of libido.
I had the girl
in there
strapped to me groin, but because of camera, whatever else, they had to sellotape her hair down to cover up the bits. So it's, when you like that, all you can feel is sellotape going like that and thinking, it takes the kind of. It concentrates the mind.
You told me you had a thing for sellotape, though.
I did, but that's only since then. You know what I mean? That was when it all happened.
I think shooting on the Reeperbahn was very, very tough because there's all the club owners there, and they all had to be given backhanders. And when we actually came to shoot there, they were asked for more, and it was a kind of slightly sort of blackmail situation. And so that was pretty scary. But you carry on.
And it was Ladyboys, you know what I mean? That's confusing as it is. George Harrison,
John Lennon.
He was just cool, wasn't he? You know what I mean?
I think John took on a lot of what Stuart taught him, showed him, and this idea that he was this original thinker who just had a brain that worked in a way that nobody else's did, and a great voice.
The Lighthouse thing came back to me really strongly because it was in 2 bits. We filmed it sort of, although we're in the scene, we filmed one bit early on in the 6 weeks and one right near the end when they went together into the same scene, and I'm kind of like. I'm always surprised that it worked, but it always does. You know what I mean?
The Lighthouse scene was a particular favourite. It was one of the first scenes that I wrote. I always had that idea that was kind of very mythic idea of spending time people together in a beautiful moment in time, I think that there's a couple of the songs work really well. Taking the speed, money intercutting with Stephen painting, and twist and shout at the end. I think it's very moving, a very very moving moment. But I love the scene with Ian and Astrid when he's looking at the books. You're a big reader.
Yeah, I like that scene. I actually like
that left bank shower.
yeah. I like what's her name actually. Just where Kai Wiesinger comes in, where Astrid and discovers Astrid in bed with Stuart, and you're wearing my robe, which is one of the tracks, or the title track, one of Don Moss's incidental pieces. Yeah. It got me. It's a little. I don't know. Summed it up really quite well. Yeah. Quite a huge amount of emotions going on, and a huge amount of betrayal and doubt and everything else. Everything you feel all captured really quite quickly and quite succinctly.
I mean, I think the thing that strikes me looking at it now is that it was made. It's a lot of preparation, a lot of anticipation. It was an important film for a lot of people. I think for a lot of us involved, it was really a kind of significant point in our career. But we shot it very very quickly. And so it was a little bit like kind of throwing stuff against the wall, and I think you see that, but I'm just glad that a lot of things seem to have stuck, and obviously there are things that kind of fell off the wall again, but we had to keep putting them back on. But I think that it was almost, it went by in a bit of a blur, really, didn't it? Yeah. And so, the fact that it kind of came out coherently was reassuring, satisfying. Apparently I was underwater in the bath, and I came up and said to my future wife, I've got a great idea for a film. It was many years later that I actually made the film, but the idea that I had, I'd been looking for a story that I suppose reflected the excitement that I felt when I was listening to music, and the yearning, the fact that somehow it seemed to be a kind of a special place that you went at a particular age, and it was somewhere that was exciting and seemed to be, I don't know, a kind of rites of passage type thing. And I was looking for an idea, and I came across, I think I was looking through some old photograph albums, or compilations of photographs, and I came across Astrid Kirchherr's photographs, and that was really the starting point for the film. I saw a photograph of this beautiful Brigitte Bardot, Jean Seberg looking woman, the photograph with her cropped blonde hair, and the Rolly camera, large format, looking into a mirror, scene that we recreate in the film, I think. And then some of the photographs she took of Stuart and some of the photographs of them together. And I'd been vaguely aware that there was this guy, on the fringe of the Beatles, or who'd been involved in the early Beatles story. But I think in my mind mixed up Pete Best and Stuart Sutcliffe. And I could tell by looking at the photographs that there was something timeless, really classy, stylish, intelligent, and really arresting and charismatic about these two people. And I thought, this is strange. I can't believe that if the people are the people that they are in the photographs, that we wouldn't have heard a little bit more about them. So I started to research the story. And I think the first port of call was to contact Stuart's mother. And I just literally looked in a telephone book in Sevenoaks, I think she was living at the time, and went through, I think she was the fourth Sutcliffe that I came across. Went to visit her and saw these amazing paintings. I mean, that was the other thing, was that this wasn't just somebody whose only claim to fame was as a footnote in the story of the Beatles, but this was a guy who in his own right was in some way sort of on the cutting edge. And the more that I looked into it, the more that I realized that here was a story that would stand in its own right. I then tracked down, via some information I got from Stuart's mother, I met his sister, Pauline Sutcliffe, and then through the information I got from them, I again sort of blind called a couple of numbers in Hamburg, and got Astrid on the other end of the phone. And she said that, she wouldn't talk to me, but if I happened to be in Hamburg, I should call her again. So the next week, I happened to be in Hamburg, and picked up the phone, and she said, agreed to meet. We spent a while talking, and then she introduced me to Klaus Voormann. And And by now I knew that this was a really wonderful story, a love triangle, almost like Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead. It was the story at the side of the big story that somehow the history of the Beatles had overshadowed what really took place in a little time capsule in those 2 years in Liverpool and Hamburg. And it dawned on me that what was particularly appropriate for what I was looking for, which was a sort of an everyman story about that rites of passage rock and roll thing, was that here was somebody who tragically died on the eve of the success of the most successful rock and roll band ever. So he didn't know what was about to happen, and so he was like us. He was, my everyman character. He shared the same dreams and the same hopes, and as far as he was concerned, it was just a dream. So I had this idea that to end the story when, if you like, the official history begins, so that there was a real accessibility for young people watching the film. Here was a group of kids who, like thousands and thousands of other groups of kids all over the world, leaving home and setting out and trying to change the world and forming a rock and roll band. And I think it was from that point that I started to put together a treatment and work on a script. But it took a long time, I would say 4, 5, 6 years from that original time, really to get to the stage where we were able to seriously think about making the film. One of the first things to work out with the script was really whose story was it. And I think largely it's Stuart's story, but it's based on Astrid's recollections. And so it wasn't just a story of Stuart and Astrid, but there was obviously Stuart, if we're telling his story, before he met Astrid, was very, very close with John Lennon, which was another element of the story that I was intrigued with, because it wasn't the version of the story that we're necessarily told. In other words, everybody knows about Lennon and McCartney, but not many people knew about Lennon and Sutcliffe. And they were very, very close at the time. And so here we had two guys arriving in Hamburg. Stuart was there because John convinced him to get in the band. They meet a girl who gets in between the two guys. So we have a love triangle there, with jealousies and tensions. But Astrid, at the time that she met Stuart, was going out with Klaus Voormann, who himself was an influence on the style of the Beatles. But also he was a great friend of Stuart and the other guys. So here we have the second triangle that was sort of interlocking, and I think that gave the dynamic, really, which a love triangle has its kind of inevitable demise within it, which gives it the kind of the transient, passing nature of that type of youthful love affair. And I think that one of the big themes of Backbeat is about desire and loss. And it's very poignant because Stuart himself died, but to a certain extent the youth, the dreams, that moment in time for all of them died as well. The last thing I wanted to do was to try and tell a story about the Beatles in Hamburg from a sort of a biographical point of view. It was essential that there was a kind of an obsession and a fascination with the particular coming together of these different people at a particular time, and what spun off from that. That was what really it seemed to draw to it so many themes. So I tried to keep focused all the time to not get diverted into telling a rock and roll biopic. In fact, at one stage, I even considered not mentioning the band as the Beatles and not mentioning anybody's surname, to really make it like an everyman group, because when they were there, they weren't the Beatles that we know. They weren't the Beatles of the four guys appearing on stage, kind of in the iconic form that they became after their success. So they were an anonymous band at that stage, and really the whole time that we were writing, we were working on it from a dramatic point of view. It was always the emphasis: this story needs to stand alone, even if it weren't about, to some degree, the Beatles. So I think that was a focus of ours, and I think it was also that sense of you know, what drove the story were the decisions that Stuart was making vis-a-vis John and vis-a-vis Astrid. It wasn't about, you know, the agenda, if you like, was part of the to become a successful rock and roll band and to cut a record and to be, you know, great live performers was creating one of the horns of the dilemma for Stuart, you know, between the painting and Hamburg and his girlfriend and his best friend and Liverpool and the rock and roll band. I mean, you had that wonderful dramatic dilemma, and the dilemma hinges on Stuart. So I think by keeping him as a focal character, we were prevented from kind of hijacking the story. When you're making a film that's based in some way on something that happened, I think it's important from a dramatic point of view to not be enslaved to the particular specifics of the story, perhaps. But I think you have to be true to the underlying truth of it. And that was something that I was very keen to do with the story, and I was very keen to know what Astrid felt about the film. And Astrid was very robust in her criticism when she thought I was departing from what happened, or when I was interpreting something that I thought was getting at the truth of an amalgamation of things that she'd said to me. And I think at the end she was very, very pleased, and I know that Cynthia Lennon and Julian Lennon very, very pleased with the way the authenticity of the film. And I know that other people, Billy Preston, for example, who was in Hamburg, felt that it was authentic, and I think it was authentic for two reasons. It was authentic because we tried to be true to the story, and you know, from my point of view, I wanted to have integrity in telling that story. I might have made, you know, Constantine in time, or made somebody meet somebody at a different point. But our research was very, very thorough. I mean, we spent years researching this and had, you know, from obviously a legal point of view, we had to have very, very thorough research. And I think when you're doing something that's real, I think my rule is make it as accurate as you can unless it gets in the way of some truth. And then you perhaps interpret and alter it a little bit. But the ground rule for everybody, for costume, for choosing the musical instruments, was absolutely rigorous research. I mean, for example, all of the instruments and the equipment that we used were authentically researched. The way that people played, the moment, the songs that were sung on particular instruments were consistent. From a photographic point of view, Astrid came and saw all the props and made sure that, you know, that was exactly what her camera was. It would be set up the way it would be set up. I went to a lot of the locations where the photographs were taken. There's a photograph in the film of Stuart before he had his mop top that Astrid gave him with a James Dean swept back quiff on top of his head, sitting on a branch. We actually photographed that scene in that location. So I wanted to know, I wanted to really kind of own and inhabit all of the places where the story happened. And in certain cases, we would we would organically kind of, you know, nudge the tiller in order to try and communicate what we felt was the truth of the story. Casting for Backbeat, I think, went over about 1.5 years period, because it took us so long to get it financed. But Ian Hart was really one of the first people that we had on board. And I went to see a film that he'd done, where he'd also played John Lennon, called The Hours and the Times. And I was sceptical after that, because even though he's fantastic in the role, it's a very, very different Lennon to the Lennon that we had in Backbeat. But it was really just meeting Ian, and you know, his fantastic warmth and wit and vivacity and Scouser humour, that again, I didn't want to look alike. I just wanted somebody who would inhabit the role, and he came on board very, very early. I talked to him, you know, a lot about research for, you know, Lennon mannerisms, and, you know, the way that he played the guitar and the way that he would kind of lean forward at the mic and hold his guitar quite kind of high up, his Rickenbacker. And we looked at this stuff, but I said to him, never let it get in the performance. You know, never imitate. And, you know, if it comes through, then that's great. And I think it did come through, but it was really Ian kind of reinterpreted the role. And then he stayed with us, and we cast all over the UK, and I think he came down to London on numerous occasions when we were looking to get Stuart Sutcliffe's, but also through the other members of the band. And we saw loads and loads of people for Stuart. And then I went to LA, I think it was just after the riots, and in a small breeze block office next to the kind of couple of burnt out shops, we spent three days seeing numerous young American actors, and Stephen, I think, was one of the first people we saw. And he was quite young at the time. I was worried. I think he was only just 18, but everything else about him was so what I was looking for Stuart. So we had our Stuart and we had our John. I also saw a lot of people for Astrid in Los Angeles, New York, and London. I missed Cheryl Lee. She was flying to LA when I was flying to New York. So I came back to. I assumed that it wasn't going to work out, or if somebody doesn't turn up for an audition, you don't sort of lose sleep about it. But the idea just kept coming back when I wasn't really happy with any of the people that I'd seen, and so we contacted her agent again and found out that she was really upset that she had missed me. So I flew out again to see her in LA, and I just knew immediately that she would be perfect for the part of Astrid. I think what it was with Stuart and Cheryl is that they had this desire for the roles, and that's so much a part of it, I think, that they connected so much with these roles. I mean, in the front of the script I put photographs and little bios and information about these characters, so beyond what was on the page they had an indication that of who these people were, and I think they that desire just went a long way to captivate them and make them come across to me as if they were the right guys. And then we had to put the band together, and that was a question of even more auditions in Liverpool and London. And that was great fun because we did a series of, I guess it was like Pop Idols or something. We had semi-finals and quarter-finals and whatever, and we had the final, I think, 10 people, and we put them together in different combinations. And by the end of that day, I knew who my band was. Well, Stephen told me that he had a dialect coach in Los Angeles who'd never been to Liverpool, called Julie Adams, I think. And he was totally confident in her ability and said that he had used her on a film he'd done called The Power of One, where he had to speak with a South African accent. And he was so convinced that I went with this and spoke to Julie, and she seemed really great. And I actually sent her some of the tapes that I had done with I actually got some Liverpool actors to tape the script and sent them to Julie. Plus, I can't remember some other source material I gave her. Anyway, I was very interested to see how this was going to happen. And Stephen sent me, and Julie sent me, with Cheryl as well, because I sent her the tapes of Astrid that I'd recorded. So she was working with Astrid, with Cheryl at the same time, to develop a sort of a German accent. And I think it was every week or every 2 weeks I would get these cassettes and I would put them on, and it was unbelievable. It was like I was hearing orally these two characters forming, the voices forming. And there was one moment when I played them to a couple of people, the producer, and I think to Ian Hart as well. And it was unbelievable. It was like we were hearing, a Scouser, Stuart Sutcliffe. I mean, we didn't want him to be really like hard Scouse because he was kind of middle-class kid. And Astrid, and it was like I was hearing the Astrid on my tape. So that was very, very exciting. And then we brought both of them over, and I introduced Astrid to Cheryl, and Stephen met Astrid as well. And then I just told him to hang out with the guys in the band who were all from Liverpool, and not to speak with his normal voice, but to speak like a Scouser all the time, no matter how stupid he might feel at first, but just not to speak with his own voice, but to always speak. From the moment that he arrived in London, he had to speak with a Liverpudlian accent. And within about 3 days, he was, you know, you couldn't tell him apart. When we were thinking about the music for the film, I always wanted it to be, again, not a counterfeit band slavishly trying to imitate the exact voices of the different Beatles or the exact sound, because I thought that that would kill what it was that made them special, which was an attitude and an energy and an attack. And I wanted to somehow replicate in the cinema audience the feeling that it must have been like if you were Astrid or Klaus, never having heard anything like this before in your life, to go into this club and just be hit in the chest, as they told me they were, by this pounding bass and this kind of adrenal driving dance music. So it was, we just wanted to replicate that attitude, and we were very lucky in persuading Don Was, great record producer, to get on board the project. And Don just put together this fantastic band to our brief of people that we thought would kind of replicate that attitude. And we had people like Mick Mills from R.E.M., Dave Grohl from Nirvana, Dave Perner from Afghan Wigs, and a whole array of really what we called a kind of a grunge supergroup at the time. And they came into the studio in Los Angeles and just in 2 days recorded as if they were on stage in Hamburg, just, you know, kick the hell out of the songs. And immediately we knew that we had this attitude. It was a real challenge to work out how to compare painting with rock and roll, because these are the two, this is the dilemma, this is the two poles in Stuart's life. And obviously when we got music, it's exciting on stage and you can be cutty and vibrant. And in a couple of scenes, one of the Money, we intercut the painting with the rock and roll, and it was, we were fortunate in the type of painting that Stuart was doing at the time, that it was very visceral. He was mixing silver car paint with coal and smearing it on the really big canvases, and using red paint that was sort of, you know, looked like blood. And the more he was becoming prolific, the more vibrant and energetic and frenetic the actual painting process was. So that was actually very, very useful, and we intercut that quite a lot. I think if you know, it was a story about a watercolorist or something, it would have not held up very well to the excitement of rock and roll, but the particular kind of the size of the canvas and the aggression and the vibrancy of the way he painted, I think, enabled us to make that comparison. I know that George Harrison was working with Pauline Sutcliffe on a book at the time that we were shooting the film, and Pauline actually, I think, drove him on the way to see us record the Twist and Shout session, which we did at the National in Kilburn. He never made it because the traffic was really bad, and we actually remarkably finished early that day. I know that also Don Was working with Ringo Starr, and I gather that, without knowing too many of the details, that Don thought that, you know, Ringo was kind of pretty okay with the film. But one of the nicest accolades that we had, other than Astrid seeing the film and absolutely really being very moved by it, was we showed the film to Cynthia Lennon because we wanted to invite her to the premiere, and obviously she wanted to know, you know, what it was that, you know, the film was doing. And I think she was very apprehensive before seeing the film, and after the film told us that she liked it very much. And the day of the premiere, we had a drink. Cynthia Lennon was there, and I noticed that Julian was there as well. And somebody handed me a copy of the Evening Standard, and there was a whole-page interview with Julian Lennon. And in it he said he was coming to see the film because his mother told him if he saw the film he would meet his father that night. So it was a great kind of accolade to have for us, but particularly for Ian Hart, who was you know, very modest about the whole idea of playing John Lennon and felt an incredible sense of responsibility. So to hear from Cynthia, who was, you know, his girlfriend at the time of the story, that this was how John was a fantastic relief and honour for Ian in particular. I know that Paul McCartney's seen Backbeat because he's commented on a couple of occasions. unfavourably. One of the things that he points up is the inaccuracy of the fact that we have John Lennon singing Long Tall Sally and not Paul McCartney singing Long Tall Sally. This was a great point of pain for us as well, because I loved McCartney's version of Long Tall Sally, and we were aware that he was the guy that normally took the vocal. In fact, I think he always took the vocal. So it was always the intention that McCartney in the movie would sing Long Tall Sally. But it happens to be a scene where Lennon is taking amphetamines for the first time. So obviously, dramatically, a lot of the action is on John Lennon. Now, in the movie, you actually hear McCartney singing, but we weren't able to cut to him very much because we had problems with lip sync. And we tried, and we actually went back into the studio to re-record the backing singer who was singing, to try and lip sync to the guy playing McCartney. We tried various things called word fit to try and vary speed the track to fit them in. And I remember talking to the producer and saying, one thing we've got to do is we've got to make it clear that McCartney sang this song. And unfortunately, after much money and a number of attempts, we failed in that. So even though you do hear McCartney singing, you don't see him singing on it. I remember somebody saying, well, nobody will ever notice that, but I knew that one person would notice it, and that would be Paul McCartney, and I'm not surprised that he did. I think what's great about the first film that you do is that you've no idea how exhausting it's going to be. So that you go in there with this kind of naive thing that, well, there's 3 days over, and it's just getting through it is a massive endurance test and active stamina. But there's something that happened to me on Backbeat which I've always brought to the set, because it is an endurance game a lot of the time. You can't be ill. If you're shooting for 64 days, you've got to be there for 14, 16 hours a day, and you've got to be on, and you've got to get through the work every day. And sometimes when I'm living the rest of my life, I wonder how I do it, and because I find it as difficult to get out of bed as the next person, but somehow something kind of when you're filming just kind of pulls you along. It's a train that takes you with it. But I think it was the third day we were faced with a really horrendous situation. One of the hair pieces was completely wrong. We were at least a day away from, or 2 days away from getting it right. It was in April on a freezing cold beach in North Wales. The tracks were sinking into the sand. Cheryl Lee had just run into the scene, run out again, and turned blue. And the costume makeup said that it would be at least another 3 hours before she came out of her caravan. And I remember feeling everything sinking into the sand with the tracks. I mean, me and the project and everything. I was starting to get really cold. I had about 3 parkas on, but it was the cold was getting right to my bones. And I just stopped myself. And I thought, I've been spending 8 years so that I could be standing here doing this, with these people here, with this camera, with this film, with these actors, with this story. And don't you dare think for 1 second that it's something that, you should kind of be regretting. And if I'd been told a year earlier that I was going to be standing freezing on that beach, I would have given anything to, in exchange for the promise that that's where I could be standing, where I was standing at that moment. And I remember I broke out in a smile, and there was a rather grumpy crew member who was standing next to me. He looked at me and said, "What are you smiling about?" And I told him this story, and a smile broke out on his face from cheek to cheek. And each day of the shoot after that, he would ask me, say, "Are you having a good time?" I said, "Having a wonderful time." And he said, "I'm having a wonderful time too." And I've always tried to remember that moment and that thought when things are particularly bad and you're kind of looking at your watch thinking, are we going to get through this? That it's a privilege. It's something that's really exciting, I hope I never forget that.
In 1958, he got through his first examen in painting and sculpturing. 1959, he had his first exhibition in Liverpool. He sold one of his paintings, and that must have been the £300 where he bought the bass from. In 1960, he went from art school in Liverpool, and he played then 1 year with the Beatles, or even more. And in autumn 1960, he became to know me. I went to see the Beatles immediately. I was excited. Not only the music was great, but the way they looked fascinated me. At first, all of them. When I got the full picture, which was so unusual for me, the faces fascinated me. And the way they looked, the way they were dressed, the way they moved. A rock and roll group on stage, you could reach out for them. It was a complete new thing. My friends, we were into the French scene, into the Sartre type, Juliette Greco, and the existentialism, Jean Cocteau, and all this type of scene. Very mystic. And then suddenly you get this bang of reality, which hit me at this moment. And then I spotted Stuart, as you know, the way he moved, it was different. It's just a feeling I had. He behaved more like he was one of us. Even he looked all scruffy, and he had not all that nice clothes on, but he had this certain air around him which fascinated me then. Klaus, my boyfriend, brought some record covers with him, which he had done for some jazz groups, and went over to John and said, I brought you some covers here to show you what I'm doing. And John said, well, you better talk to him. He's the artist of the family. And that was Stuart. And so Stuart was very polite and nice and talked to us. And I was just fascinated by his face. His face was so delicate, and so the way he spoke was so quiet and so unusual, so kind. But we both, Klaus and I, had immediately the feeling that Stuart was glad to meet us. I already had in mind then to take pictures of Stuart, because it's a normal reaction if somebody reacts nice to you. But the fascination, when I think now, it was the visual attraction and the feeling of sensibility around Stuart, which attracted me first, because it wasn't a sexual attraction towards a beautiful boy, not at all. It was just sort of vibes going round and round. He had this hairstyle which was, now we think, oh great, and kids try to do the same hairstyle, but then for me it was awful. It was all combed back and greasy, and it didn't look very clean, and he had these glasses on and sunglasses stuck in front of the glasses, and a dirty little jacket, and some undescribable little trousers, and pointed shoes, and a little very, very poor sweater underneath. So there was no attraction whatsoever. But he had this air around him, the knowledge and the vibes he gave me, which immediately made me think, oh, he's one of the family. The band never meant anything to him. He was laughing at himself playing the bass because he couldn't do it, So he just did it to do John a favor, to buy a guitar. And he always admitted, I'm not a musician, I'm an artist. And I just do that to please John and have some fun.
Paul can play bass a lot better than I can. He can sing a lot better too.
I asked them if I could take pictures of them. But it took so long to arrange it all, Maybe we took the pictures 3 weeks after I met them first. Because I had to work in the day and going to the Kaiserkeller at night. And being at work in the morning, it was very hard, Color never interested me then. I had to do color pictures for the studio for Reinhard I worked for. But it never ever interested me. Black and white was the thing. And of course I've been influenced by Reinhard Wolf, who was a very, very famous photographer for portraits then. And his work is just incredible. And then on top of it, all these Jean Cocteau films and the French movies, which were only in black and white at the time. And the whole art of being, of existence, the way the French people did, like Juliette Gréco and Sartre, the whole lot, that fascinated me. You know, he started with doing the drawings on the very thin paper, and it developed, it got more abstract and abstract. These drawings he did very fast, maybe a day or maybe half an hour, you know. Why did he want to paint? Because I don't think he knew himself why. He just wanted it and that's it. He didn't ask himself why. I couldn't tell you how his mind worked and how quick he was. I only felt his intelligence and the way his mind used to go from one subject to another, and how his brain was working all the time and being creative, and he was just right there all the time. But the real meaning of it, I didn't understand.
There goes Stu Sutcliffe.
He fell in love with a German girl. He could have been in the Beatles, but he never really learned how to play.